Welcome everyone to the latest edition of our podcast, CGI Unpacked. In this episode, we will be talking about the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act and CGI's review of the Act. My name is Rachel Lindsay. I'm an inspector with CGI and I led on this review for the organisation. So I have a number of guests with me today and I'm going to ask each one of you to introduce yourselves and say which organisation you're from. So I'll start.
Lindsay Fisher, Police Service of Northern Ireland, Head of Public Protection Branch.
Emma Crozier, Head of Violence Against the Person Branch, Department of Justice.
Sarah Mason, CEO of Women's Aid Federation, Northern Ireland.
Caroline Conway, I work for the Public Prosecution Service and I'm the policy lead there on domestic abuse.
Well, you're all very welcome this morning and I know it's a topic that you're all very passionate about. So what we're going to talk about today, as I said, is the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, and that was enacted in Northern Ireland in 2021. And as part of the Act itself, the CGI, an independent oversight was required to ensure that this Act was being established and introduced appropriately. So the Minister of Justice asked CGI to undertake this work, and we've now published our review of that work. So firstly, just to start off with, Emma, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the Act and what the intention of the Act was?
Yes, no problem. So on the return of the Assembly back in 2020, Justice Minister Naomi Long made this a priority. She wanted to see the domestic abuse offence introduced in Northern Ireland. It was the first Act introduced in that mandate, and the main purpose of the Act really was to create a new domestic abuse offence which reflected the experience of victims, the repetitive nature of abusive behaviour and that potential cumulative effect of domestic abuse. So importantly, the coercive behaviour can consist of that psychological and more emotional abuse, not just physical violence and threats, which typically had been what was domestic abuse thought of before.
And Caroline, maybe you can tell us from a prosecution point of view what makes the Act, the offences in this Act different to what already existed.
Well, I think a real strength of the domestic abuse offence that is created by the Act is that it, as Emma said, it criminalises that course of abusive behaviour, and that includes coercive controlling behaviour, that psychological abuse and isolation that was always previously difficult to prosecute under other existing criminal offences prior to the implementation of the Act. I think for prosecutors prior to February 2022, I think the criminal justice system essentially viewed domestic abuse as a series of discrete incidents, focusing on domestic violence, really. So whenever victims came to court, they were asked to focus on a particular incident on a particular date. And because of the rules of evidence, they weren't really able to explain everything that had been happening in the build-up to that assault, for example. So I think now with the domestic abuse offence, that evidence can be introduced to the court and can be heard by the court, and they can take that into account whenever they're kind of hearing a case.
Okay, great. And I know obviously CGI has done a work on domestic abuse in the past, recognising how important it is. Sarah, how important do you think it was that this Act was brought in, this piece of legislation, to help address domestic abuse?
It was vital. It was absolutely vital, and we'd waited quite some years for it. It had sat on a shelf for 3 years, so bringing it in, and actually we did have the advantage of seeing how it had rolled out in other jurisdictions across the UK. I think having the additional child aggravator in Northern Ireland was a really, really good win, but it's something that we had been calling for a long, long time. Domestic abuse is a major issue in Northern Ireland, and the more legislative powers we have to address it and support women, children, young people and protect people from further harm, the better.
Okay. And Lindsay, from a policing perspective, how serious an issue is domestic abuse, and what impact do you think this piece of legislation has had?
Domestic abuse has a huge impact on policing demands. We regularly talk about the fact that domestic abuse is over 20% of the crimes that are reported. So in terms of the numbers and the volume, it's really important. But actually, the fact that we have set it aside as a service strategic priority, and we have done for a number of years, shows the importance. But actually, the legislation itself, for me, it empowers police officers who are doing that first response. They're going out, they're going into a family home, and before they were walking in, talking about how they felt the hairs in the back of their neck standing on end, just the level of toxicity that was within that setting. But if there was no injuries, no assaults, no physical damage, really very little that we had the power to do. So this is a huge change in the landscape for us. And I think too, thinking about and the focus on coercive controlling behaviour as an offence actually allowed us to focus on how perpetrators behave and how they coerce and control not only their victim, but those services that engage with them.
Okay. And as I said at the start, obviously CGI have been asked to undertake this review, and the legislation specifies that needs to be done for the next 7 years. So this is going to be an ongoing piece of work for us. Emma, why do you think that part of the legislation was included, and why is that so important?
I think it's really important to enable us to get a balanced and impartial view of how the legislation was implemented, and really what went well, what didn't go well, and what could be changed, I suppose. Really, I suppose that's both in terms of the domestic abuse offence and whether things need improved there, but also for further legislation that the department's bringing forward and anything we can learn from that could be applied here.
Okay. So talking then about the review that we've carried out, and we know, as Emma said, there have been some positive findings, some areas for improvement, but we recognise that there's been a huge amount of work that's been undertaken to implement this. From a policing perspective, Lindsay, what have been kind of some of the challenges and some of the successes for the police in implementing?
I think the successes first is highlights again the necessity of this legislation. We used the legislation and the powers within the first 24 hours. So I think that highlights the understanding, the focus, and the drive around it. But some of the challenges, I suppose, are, as we know, the increasing demand, the diminishing resource, but the fact that we see this throughout all of our new domestic abuse legislation pieces, how quickly they're used, how quickly we're presenting them before the court, how many people have been engaged in the training and awareness. I think probably some of the challenges, because we were focused so much on the general legislation and what the new offence came, I think some of the learning is, and we're picking that up now, and we've done new training, was around the child aggravators, and I suppose how easy it was to add those. And we thought that message was landing, but whenever we started to do our own audit and inspection around that, we knew that it wasn't. So we built on that training, and actually you could feel the light bulb moment in the room with officers whenever they had that focused training around the child aggravators and how to use them. But still lots and more to do every day. There is something new that's presented, and I suppose it's working with the partners involved in this podcast to make sure that we're throughout the inspections and beyond that we're continuing to work together to improve.
Okay. Yep. And Caroline, similarly for the PPS, what have been some of the successes and some of the challenges?
I think in terms of training, we entered into a 3-year training program with Women's Aid Federation and Sarah. So I think that was a particular success. I know that we had to shift prosecutors' mindsets from looking at domestic abuse as those discrete violent incidents and kind of looking at the wider picture of what was happening in that house. So we spent a lot of time covering coercive control and the different forms of domestic abuse, and all our prosecutors had to complete that training. So I think that was really, really beneficial and a particular success. I think our training package that we delivered was very good. A particular challenge for us, and I think Lindsay might agree, was the IT systems. Mm-hmm. I think we spent years trying to kind of develop our IT systems so that we could share messages from police service to PPS, to courts, and the messaging those child aggravators, that was a particularly big area that was challenging for us, perhaps delayed implementation for a few months, and it was costly as well.
Yes, IT is always the main problem, isn't it? And so we've talked about the change, Caroline's talked about the change from looking at individual incidents to the domestic abuse offence and the course of behaviour. From a victim's perspective, why is it important to use an offence like that?
It's an absolute mind shift on viewing domestic abuse. Lindsay's already referred to this. The focus now is on behaviours, and it's the behaviour of a perpetrator and the impact that's having on an entire household. Having the child aggravator there is vitally important. Everyone is impacted. Coercive control, it's very difficult. You can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't smell it, but you walk into a house and you can feel it. It's like methane gas, it could go off at any time. It's been there forever. It is about that pattern of behaviour, and it actually always worked very well on behalf of a perpetrator because there's no physical evidence, but that control is there, and that underlying threat that anything could happen at any time is there. So actually having that brought in to law is amazing. Getting that message out there, because a lot of women will not say coercive control. What they will say though, constantly, as will children, is walking on eggshells. Not sure what's going to happen next. Yesterday that was okay, today it's not. That behaviour and that control. So it's actually been an amazing addition. And I think even if we look at Jane Monckton-Smith's timeline on femicide, that that is controlling throughout. And now we're focusing on the behaviour of a perpetrator. And I think that's vitally important. It's not about what happened to that victim, what happened to that child. That support needs to be there, but let's focus on that behaviour that's impacting on a wide range of people within a home.
Okay. And I know that you were particularly pleased about the child aggravators and the focus on children within this piece of legislation.
Absolutely. And it has been a leverage, in the past, the CJI inspections, our leverage is to see change and policy shift and, additions of like the assist model and advocates. But in this case, it's been vital. We've been talking about children hidden victims for so long in Women's Aid. They come into refuge. They're part of the service provision, identifying that there is harm there. They are resilient, but actually that leverage, we were able to then work very closely with our colleagues in health and justice to put a children's pillar within the domestic and sexual abuse strategy. That addition, and we had a group of young people that actually helped write the pillar because they were there when the police attended. They have dealt with social services. They have a voice. They see it, they hear it, they feel it. And we have to now ensure, now we have the legislation, we're looking at the rollout, that the support is there to support both women and children from coming through that journey of that coercive control behaviour.
And Lindsay, from in addition to the child aggravators that you've talked about, part of the Act covered the rollout and of Operation Encompass. Could you say a little bit more about what that is and how successful that's been?
I think Operation Encompass has been really successful, and I suppose whenever I think about the journey that we've been on with it over the last couple of years, I still keep coming back to the last rollout in Belfast, where I had the privilege of being in one of our special needs schools, and I just looked around and thought, there are young people here that could not have physically found the words, the actions to say what they've been experienced at home. Some were non-verbal, and that could have presented in really challenging behaviour. But the fact that we're able to step in really quickly, share the information that something that has been going on at home, that just allows those caretakers during the day. We are entrusting our young people into the education setting every day. So it's vitally important that they have all of the information they need to make sure that young person feels safe and heard and protected from what is going on. And that might just be that opportunity to say, is everything okay? Or to be a particular way with a child who is non-verbal or struggles with behavioural presentation. So I think it's been huge. It is a challenge. It is whenever we think about the numbers, we've had over 15,000 referrals through Up Encompass, but I still focus on the fact that even with the challenging conversations I have internally about the resource to do it, everybody starts with, this is so good. We want to be able to do this, and we want to make sure that we don't drop the ball, simply because of the numbers. But the fact that there's tens of thousands of children who just heard a little bit quicker is amazing.
Can I add?
Yeah.
I think the numbers were always there. And I think now we have another agency that's aware, and education are calling for more support, because we already are in there doing helping hands. What we're creating more social guardians, because everyone can do something. So even the fact that a child's coming into class, they were awake at 2:00 in the morning, mom still got them into school, someone's aware that something happened, and there's a bit of support for that child. It actually opens that out. People used to say you're opening a can of worms. If you start asking what's going on, they're already in the can of worms, but we're all opening it together. So those numbers were always there. This was always happening. Young kids were going into school and there'd been an incident at home. I think it's an absolutely amazing initiative, and it removes it not just from a police incident to actually someone in education going, this child, we wanted to reach its full potential, and actually now we know something went on and we can give that. They didn't do their homework. It's not a big deal. They may need to put their head in the desk for 20 minutes because they were awakened in the middle of the night. This is just amazing. It's everybody supporting and working together. So I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I think it's really proud that it was rolled out so promptly, so quickly, and right across Northern Ireland in such a quick time. Yeah.
Okay. And in sort of when the Act was introduced and the concept of coercive and controlling behaviour, there was a lot of awareness raising done. Emma, can you talk a bit about kind of how that, do you think that's worked?
Definitely, yeah. So when the offence went live, the department introduced a multimedia awareness campaign. So it had TV advertisements, radio, outdoor advertising and social media. And it brought together, it was 6 different scenarios really to cover those, to show the breadth of victims that can be affected by domestic abuse. Women's Aid and our other voluntary partners were integral in helping us to develop those scenarios to make sure they were true to life and really represented the experience of victims. So we had one for female, male, same-sex relationships, familial, a victim with disability. So the feedback from that multimedia awareness campaign was really positive. We got it evaluated by a research company, and it showed that really that mindset is starting to change, that domestic abuse isn't just about the physical abuse, that coercive control is really an issue that needs addressed and tackled.
And so looking to the future then, obviously this is our CGI's first review. We will, as I said, be coming back for the next 7 years. So next year we'll be looking at how the recommendations that we've made have been implemented. What sort of plans are in place or work has been already started to address the recommendations? Maybe Lindsay, if we start with.
So obviously focusing on some of the learning, thinking about upskilling around child aggravators, thinking about how we either reflect how the use of AB interviews, for example. So they have been trained out. We've had a victim survivor come in and speak to groups of officers and staff members around their own experience and the impact that had on their child. And I think it's been really powerful. So we've already started some of that work, but actually it's about making sure that we keep that focus, not just in the domestic abuse offence, but actually in that wider context of how we tackle all domestic abuse offences, and we make sure that we are using the right legislation, the right fit, and those conversations need to keep going. And we do have that quality assurance set up with PPS to make sure that we're both on the same page, because what I don't want is officers continuing to put in files that have things that PPS want to see. There's no point in continuing that. We want to make sure that we're building on the successes that we have had and taking that learning.
Okay. And Caroline, from a PPS perspective?
Yes, we're committed to kind of, building on that prosecution team approach, like Lindsay mentioned, and really engaging and communicating with police, and whenever decisions are taken on the evidence available, communicating that back to police so that we build understanding and promote the use of the domestic abuse offence and the aggravators. I think in terms of what we've done so far, in February of this year, PPS released their policy for prosecuting cases of domestic abuse, and that is intended to help the public understand how we take decisions, explain to them what to expect whenever they come to court, and also the kind of safeguards and the measures available to them to support them through the court process. Our training commitment to domestic abuse is ongoing. We have the domestic homicide timeline training coming up that will be made available to all prosecutors. And we're also working with Men's Advisory Project on some domestic abuse training, covering the kind of issues relevant to men as victims of domestic abuse. So yes, we're committed to yeah.
Okay. And Emma, from a DOJ perspective?
Yeah, so the department, there were recommendations relating to further promoting the e-learning package that we had developed, and also the statutory guidance. So I think we've got two good products there that we work with statutory and voluntary sector partners to develop, particularly the e-learning, Women's Aid, Men's Advisory Project, and other voluntaries produce that on our behalf. It's just a matter of getting that out there and making sure that staff right across various disciplines, agencies are completing that, and we're really getting the message out. So work has begun to try and further promote and encourage uptake of both the e-learning training and the statutory guidance as well.
Excellent. Okay. And Sarah, I know that you've obviously been involved very closely with the agencies in helping to implement the Act. What would your hope be for when we come back to look at this again next year?
Well, I think all the agencies have been working very closely with Women's Aid and that, but just to note, Women's Aid have been working on their own development. So every time we're doing training with all of these agencies, we have our own extensive e-learning package that is accessed by the 220 staff across all Women's Aid services, so that the women on the ground working with the women and children coming through are aware of the legal remedies, are aware of the language, are aware of all of the great things that have been implemented to ensure they're used. All of the recommendations, I read it, I was very pleased with it, and I think the thing that I do believe is that they're all achievable, because Emma's just said it. There's a lot of things already in place. We're ready, talking to the PSNI about looking at the child's response to police response, something we've looked at before in the past. These things can be developed very, very quickly. And as I always say, the best way to do it is to ask the women, children, young people that were affected, what would have been the best response, what wasn't a good response. So I'm hopeful that this is achievable, and we will continue to work as best we can in a partnership approach.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you everyone for taking part in today's podcast and for all the work that has been done so far. And we look forward to kind of coming back to see further progress next year. So this has been CGI's podcast. We will be moving on to our next podcast episode in the next couple of months. So I hope that you will tune in and enjoy listening. Thank you.